We're very excited to have you all here for this interesting topic. First, a couple of words about the sponsor. The Silverstein Lecture Series is a public outreach effort of the Center for Genetic Medicine, which is a unit in the Northwestern University Medical School whose goal is to help both better understand genetics and learn how to apply genetic issues to the better practice of medicine from the standpoint of improved therapies as well as improved diagnosis. But I think in order for the public to really be able to use the fruits of this effort with some understanding, it's important for us to do a good job helping the public understand important issues related to genetics. And in many ways, I can think of no more important issue related to genetics than the topic that's under discussion tonight. After all, in the mind of many of us, DNA, which is at the root of genetics, is in fact probably one of the best lines of evidence that supports the idea of evolution. The Silverstein Lecture Series are generously supported by an endowment that comes from the Herman M. and B.L. Silverstein Foundation. And that endowment has provided this series in an ongoing way for the last 5 years and will continue to do so in the future. In the past, we've tackled such issues as genetic testing, the social and ethical implications of that. Last year, we had a very interesting series discussing the issues of genes and race, which is also another very interesting topic. Herman Silverstein, who is the person that provided us this opportunity, was an eminent attorney and the board chairman of the Mid-American Bank in Chicago, and also was president of Chicago's George F. Harding Museum. He and his wife, Bea, over the years have been very generous philanthropists across the city of Chicago. And any of you that have ever been in the Art Institute and seen this long hallway that has the extensive collection of armor, that actually was also a donation by the Silversteins. They also have made generous contributions to Northwestern Memorial Hospital. So we're really excited to have some really outstanding experts in the area of the discussion of how social and political concerns can impact science. And there's probably no better example of that today than the whole question of evolution. So those of you that were coming thinking you were going to see a debate between evolution and intelligent design, I think are going to be disappointed. Our design was never to have a debate, but rather to focus on this question from the perspective of what is science, and how is science and the perception of science influenced by a political and social environment. And evolution is probably the best example of that issue that I can think of right now. And so we have two, I think, of the world's experts in terms of thinking about that issue. Our agenda for this evening is we will hear two presentations from our two distinguished lecturers. And then we've tried to design the program so there's a fairly large chunk of time for question and answer sessions, because I don't know about you, but I find that I actually learn often as much from the questions and answers as I do from the lectures. So this is a topic that usually engenders a lot of questions. We're pretty confident there will be a few. So I'd hope you'll, as you think of things during the presentations, I hope you'll jot down your ideas and have those questions ready for us during the question and answer session. So our first speaker is Eugenie Scott. She's the executive director of the National Center for Science Education. And it's a pro-evolution, nonprofit science education organization that has members in every state. Scott is a nationally recognized proponent of the separation of church and state and serves on the national advisory councils for both Americans United for the Separation of Church and State as well as the American Civil Liberties Union. She's internationally recognized as an expert on this, has written a really outstanding book that you'll hear a little bit more about later, that any of you that want to read a little bit more about this can go look at, as has our second speaker, who I'll mention in a bit. And she really brings, I think, a useful perspective to this question. So I hope you will join me in welcoming Eugenie Scott to the podium.
Thank you very much, Dr. Chisholm. Well, good evening. It's nice to see such a large group of people here tonight. The weather's really nice out there. I mean, I come from coastal California. We've had nothing but 3 weeks of rain, and I tell you, if this was California and the weather was this nice, there wouldn't be anybody here. But I'm very, very pleased that you decided to come here. Now, why are you doing this? All right, this is my new computer, by the way, so interesting things may be happening here. Some of you may have noticed in the last few months some information about a school district in southeastern Pennsylvania. A couple of years ago, the school district in Dover, Pennsylvania, was considering the adoption of high school biology textbooks. And the teachers wanted a very mainstream, normal publishers, Prentice Hall textbook. But one of the school board members in Dover didn't want them to adopt this book and actually held up the adoption of the book for a couple of years, arguing that the book was laced with Darwinism, and therefore it was unacceptable. He wanted this standard biology textbook to be balanced by a textbook called Of Pandas and People, which promoted an idea called intelligent design. Well, for this was a controversy that went on for quite some time, actually, in Dover, Pennsylvania. And eventually, after much wrangling, the school board passed, over the objections of many citizens, a policy requiring the teaching of intelligent design and also the teaching of the, quote, gaps/problems in Darwin's theory. Now, I'm going to warn you right now, you will go blind if you try to read all of these newspaper articles. That is not the point of me showing you. This is a prop, okay? The only reason I'm showing you this is because it has a great splashy headline, Intelligent Design Voted In, just like the next slide, Parents Sue over Intel. Okay, so this is what I'm talking about. You're not supposed to be reading all the text. No. This is the problem that you have when you lecture to smart people, because they read everything. So just overcome your normal tendencies. Indeed, a group of citizens did sue the school board over the teaching of intelligent design and gaps, problems, and evolution. And the case eventually made its way to federal district court, and there was a 6-week trial where the intelligent design proponents and opponents could present under oath testimony supporting the idea that intelligent design is science and that it is good pedagogy to teach it in the public school. After listening to 6 weeks of testimony, I mean, this was a long trial. It was very thorough. The judge was pretty amazing in his treatment of the material. He basically invited more and more and more information. He allowed objections to, he disallowed objections. He allowed both sides to present pretty much whatever they wanted. And at the end of this period of time, he decided that intelligent design was in fact not science. Now, you can read this decision on the National Center for Science Education website. It's quite a good decision, very clearly written. It's actually understandable prose, which is more than you can say for many legal decisions. And I would encourage you to read it because it's very educational. But I think it's important to stand back and really look at what was the issue in Dover, Pennsylvania that engendered this very contentious trial. The issue is, what do you teach in high school science class? Specifically, what do you teach in high school biology class? The issue was not, what should everybody know to be an educated citizen? The issue was not, how do we be sensitive to some people's religious view? The issue is a narrow one. What do you teach in high school biology class? And what a high school biology teacher does when making that decision is look at the sum total of the consensus view of science as college-level biologists and professional biologists consider it. They look at what is biology in terms of what professional biologists accept. And from that large consensus of information, they choose a subset which is appropriate to the limited background and cognitive abilities and so forth of high school students. Just like physics teachers don't teach string theory, they teach optics. So a biology teacher selects from the wide consensus view of biological sciences aspects of biology that are appropriate for the high school classroom. Some evolution is taught. As a matter of fact, evolution is a very important part of the college level and the high school biology curriculum. But something like intelligent design is outside of the consensus. It is not considered by professional scientists to be acceptable science. So the argument in Dover, Pennsylvania, and in many other communities around the country really has to do with whether or not it's appropriate to bring something into the high school curriculum that is not even considered part of science. And I think that's something that we really do need to think about. Because the topic of evolution is something that is not well accepted in the American public today, particularly in comparison to the acceptance of evolution in other countries, in other developed nations. The Gallup organization for a number of years has asked a series of questions about the acceptance of evolution among American adults, and he asks 3 questions. One, God created people in their present form about 10,000 years ago, and when you compare the public's view of this to the scientists' view of this, the percentages are quite strikingly different, as you can see. He also asks the question, evolution occurred, but God had nothing to do with it. Again, the percentage of the general public who accepts this versus the percentage of scientists who accept this is quite different. From these kinds of data, many people conclude, well, all scientists are atheists, or science is an inherently atheistic process, and therefore evolution is an atheistic idea, and so the issue becomes you have to choose between Christian creationism or atheistic evolution. But that is actually a misnomer, a misunderstanding of what's actually going on here. Because Gallup asks a third question, and his third question is, evolution took place, but it was guided by God. And the percentage of scientists and the general public who accept this is extremely similar. These are all plus or minus, obviously, as all social science poll data are. So it is not the case that all scientists are atheists, but it is the case that the huge, huge majority of scientists accept evolution compared to a very large percentage of the general public who reject it. To understand the creationism and evolution controversy, it's useful to understand a little history. Back in the Scopes trial of 1925, William Jennings Bryan made essentially 3 arguments when he was presenting the case against Scopes. He argued that evolution is unsupported science. Evolution is a theory in crisis. Scientists are giving up on evolution. It's really not it's being rejected by the scientific community. He also argued, as one could understand, that evolution is incompatible with religion. By religion, he meant, of course, Christian religion. And he also argued that citizens, rather than experts like scientists or science teachers, should determine the curriculum. He who pays the piper calls the tune. And since education in the United States is a highly decentralized activity where local school districts pay for it and determine through their elected school boards what will go on, that if a local district decided that it wanted or didn't want to teach a particular subject, this should be a local discussion. This should be a local consideration. These same 3 arguments are still being made today. Only they've been expanded slightly because there's more information on each of these topics. Today we have what at NCSE we call the Pillars of Creationism, which is the idea that evolution is in fact a theory in crisis. Scientists are giving up on evolution. This comes as a big surprise to the scientific community to hear this, but we get letters to the editor sent to us by NCSE members from all over the country. This idea is alive and well in the general public, that evolution is on the skids scientifically. And it is just simply empirically wrong. We also get frequently the argument made that you have to choose. Evolution and religion, Christian religion, are incompatible. It's one or the other. You're either a creationist or an evolutionist. There's no intermediate possibilities whatsoever. And that, of course, is also empirically wrong as well. And the third of the pillars of creationism that we find today is what we call the fairness issue. Well, you're teaching evolution, but there's a lot of people out there who really object to it, so let's balance evolution with the teaching of something else. Let's balance it with the teaching of creationism. But of course, that runs into problems with the Establishment Clause of the First Amendment, because that would be advocating a religious view. So, well, okay, so let's teach evolution, but let's teach something called creation science to balance it out. Creation science is basically a biblical literalist view, but the claim is made that there are scientific data and theory that would support a special creation. Nowadays, you hear, well, okay, teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of intelligent design. And the creationism du jour that we're dealing with, especially now and after the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, is, well, teach evolution, but balance it with the teaching of the evidence against evolution. So I'll be talking about that kind of fairness issue quite a bit tonight, because it's very important. In the United States today, there are two kinds of anti-evolutionism. There's the Bible-based creation science form of creationism, which is basically biblical literalist. God created everything all at one time in its present form, and most commonly creation science holds to a young earth view. This creation event took place about 10,000 years ago. But there's also a design-based kind of creationism, which of course is the foundation for the intelligent design argument, which was the issue in Dover, Pennsylvania. And this is, in my opinion, and the opinion of others who have studied this issue, a subset of the larger creation science argument. In other words, well, to be snotty about it, intelligent design is creationism light, okay? There are claims made in creation science that are not made in intelligent design. For example, the intelligent design people don't talk about the age of the earth. Some of them are old earthers, some of them are young earthers. The intelligent design people don't talk very much about Noah's flood. Some of them believe it was a historical event. Others think that it's just a religious story. And so these are outside of the canon, as it were, of intelligent design. That said, everything that you find in intelligent design, the concept of irreducible complexity, the concept of information theory allowing you to detect intelligence and so forth and so on, what few actual scientific claims that are made with intelligent design have previously been made by creation science proponents. So this is why the diagram shows intelligent design as a subset of the larger argument of creation science. Both intelligent design and creation science rest upon a Christian theological view called special creationism, which obviously, as all Christians, believe God created. But special creationism is a claim about how God created. What did God do and when did he do it? In special creationist theology, God creates everything in its present form. So if we were able to go back in time, we would find that galaxies and the sun and the solar system and the earth and the plants and animals on earth, everything that we see in the universe today is pretty much as we see it today. That God created, especially in terms of biological organisms, God created things in their present form. And the kinds of organisms have limited genetic variability. So you can get variation within the kind. And a lot of times when the intelligent design proponents are talking about, oh, we accept evolution, they're talking about they're accepting evolution within these genetically limited kinds. So there would be a dog kind that would include dogs and wolves and foxes and other canids. There'd be a cat kind, which would include lions and tigers and house cats and pumas and bobcats and so forth. But the dog kind and the cat kind never had a common ancestor, which is what evolution would hold. In special creation, God creates the dog kind and the cat kind separately, and they never come together, so to speak, in any kind of a genealogical sense. And the dog kind and the cat kind have limited genetic variation, so you can get evolution within those kinds. Of course, these are not scientifically validated concepts, and there are a great deal of science that simply refutes these claims for being science. If you wish to believe in this, you must believe in this strictly from a religious standpoint, because the science simply does not hold. Because there really isn't any science to support special creationism theology, what you find in the creation science and intelligent design literature is what they refer to as the two-model approach. In the two-model approach, what you find is the argument that there's only two possibilities. There's either evolution or there's creationism. So all you have to do is disprove evolution, and you have proven the default position. So most of the literature consists of attacks upon evolution. Why evolution can't do the job. Why natural selection is inadequate to produce the body plans of the Cambrian invertebrates or something like that. Arguments against evolution don't really prove creationism, however, because there's too many options over there on the creationist side. This is like saying, I can paint my house either red or blue. If I don't paint it red, therefore I've painted it blue. Except there's other colors besides blue that I might choose from. And this is the way it is over here on the special creationism side. There is the predominant form of Christian theology, actually, what is held by Catholics and mainstream Protestants, is something called theistic evolution, which is that evolution happened, but it was God's plan, and God in some sense guides it or has something to do with it. Lots of different kinds of theistic evolution. But let's not be sucked into thinking that religion is only the Middle Eastern monotheisms. There's a great deal more to religion than just Christianity, Judaism, and Islam. And disproving evolution doesn't prove that the Hindus are right, or the Hopi are right, or the Australian Aborigine, or anybody else. So the idea that arguments against evolution, disproving evolution, even if you were able to do it, and I assure you they have not succeeded in this endeavor, even if you were able to disprove evolution, this would not prove special creationism is the only possible alternative. But disproving evolution indeed is what the creationists of both stripes are endeavoring to do, and endeavoring to have taught to students in the American public schools. They have a number of topics that they refer to as the alleged evidence against evolution, one of which is gaps in the fossil record. On the other hand, evolutionary biologists and paleontologists never expected there to be an unbroken stream of fossils from the very simplest to the incredible rich diversity of life forms that we have today. That isn't what we expect to find. You find a great deal of straw man building in the creationist literature. The fact that we don't have an unbroken fossil record for every creature on the planet does not disprove evolution any more than our lack of knowledge of what Abraham Lincoln had on April 23rd, 1862, means that Abraham Lincoln didn't exist on that day. It's the same sort of thing. In any historical science, you make inferences to cover the information that is simply not available, but that does not substantially weaken a very strong fossil record. One of the more interesting aspects of the creationist attack on evolution is a major confusion that they make between natural cause and chance. To them, any natural cause is random, chaotic, chance, unguided, impossible to produce anything that's organized or functional, which of course simply misunderstands a number of scientific principles in terms of biology. Clearly, natural selection. Natural selection happens to be a natural process which does generate complex and highly functional adaptations. But to the creationists, this cannot be, because they equate natural cause with chance or randomness or a lack of any kind of ability to produce complex things. So they will argue that you cannot get new body plans from random mutation and natural selection. As Dr. Chisholm said, genetics is the core principle of biology. Is the core principle of evolution. Evolution makes sense because we understand so much about how genes are passed on. Evolution, in many respects, is a genealogical relationship of species through time. And thus the process of heredity undergirds what we know about the major mechanisms of evolution. And to argue that that major complex features are unable to be explained through natural process simply violates what we know from genetics as well as evolutionary theory. They will argue, again, the idea that chance cannot produce design, and the origin of life is a particularly favorite topic. It's viewed as the soft underbelly of evolutionary biology. The fact that scientists do not at this point have a consensus as to how the first replicating structure came about is viewed by the creationists as evidence against evolution. Well, of course, that's irrelevant, because however the first replicating structure came about, that's where evolution begins. The origin of life is not an evolutionary topic. We don't care how it came about. We don't care how it got started. But once you get something that can reproduce and change through genetic mutation, what happened? Did everything appear all at one time in its present form? Or was there a descent with modification through time, which is what evolution claims, and for which we have a great deal of data? So the origin of life is kind of a red herring for the anti-evolution movement. They talk a great deal in the literature, and we don't have time to go into it in detail, about alleged differences between microevolution and macroevolution. Macroevolution being the descent with modification, which is what evolution is all about. Macroevolution being the principle of common ancestry. And microevolution referring to those population-based characteristics based on genetics, natural selection, mutation, migration, drift, and so forth. In other words, things that can happen within a kind. So they accept microevolution because that's just variation within the created kind, but you can't get new kinds. That violates the special creation theology. In order to understand where we are today, we have to look at a little bit of history. Back in the late 70s, now if you try to read that, you really will go blind, so please don't try. Back in the late 70s and early 80s, there were a number of bills introduced in state legislatures around the country, 23, 24 of them, in which balancing evolution with creation science was going to be required by law. Arkansas Bill 590 was the first bill to pass an equal time, Arkansas was the first state to pass an equal time law. And Bill 590 was very quickly challenged by a number of citizens in Arkansas. Interestingly enough, McLean versus Arkansas, the lead plaintiff was the Reverend Bill McLean. The plaintiffs in McLean versus Arkansas were religious leaders of a variety of denominations because they did not want a sectarian biblical literalist Christian theology being taught Monday through Friday, and then on Saturday and Sunday have to straighten the kids out as far as what their own theology was. So, this is not a science versus religion thing in the true sense. This is one religious view versus everybody else. Let there be light. This is being videotaped, so I guess they figured that let there not be light. That's all right. So Arkansas 590 was challenged in the courts, and there was, just like in, we can handle it, I don't care. As long as you're happy, I'm happy. In McLean versus Arkansas, there was a full trial, much as in Kitzmiller versus Dover. In McLean, the issue was, is it constitutional to teach creation science? In Kitzmiller, is it constitutional to teach intelligent design? So the two trials were really quite similar in many respects. There was a very esteemed group of scientists that were called up to represent the plaintiffs, the anti-creationist side, including the well-known scientist Stephen Jay Gould. All of these men look very young in this picture, but this was back in 1980, so we all looked really young back then. The witnesses for the defense were considerably less well-known scientists. The legal team for the plaintiffs was very skilled and managed to get the various expert witnesses for the defense to admit some things that were, shall we say, not good for the credibility of the defense there. And eventually, at the end of the trial, creation science was struck down. It was declared to be not science at all, much as intelligent design was struck down this last year in the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. Well, the creationists lost so badly in McLean versus Arkansas that they didn't even appeal. And so McLean remained just a federal district court level decision. However, another state, neighboring Louisiana, passed an equal time bill, and over a period of years, this bill went back and forth among the courts and eventually reached the Supreme Court, where in Edwards versus Aguillard, that's Don Edwards there, excuse me, that's Don Aguillard. No, Edwards is the governor. In Edwards versus Aguillard, the Supreme Court struck down creation science. So any of you who hear of a teacher teaching creation science, the kind thing for you to do would be to tell that teacher that she or he is really putting their school district in jeopardy, because they are likely to be sued and they will lose because the Supreme Court has already spoken on this issue. Well, creation science then turned out to be kind of a dud for the anti-evolutionist movement, and this was clear even as early as McLean versus Arkansas in the early 1980s. In the early 1980s, a group of conservative Christians, led largely by John Buell from the Foundation for Thought and Ethics, started trying to work out a different kind of creationism that wouldn't make the same mistakes as creation science. Creation science made one mistake by using the word creation. That kind of tends to sound sort of religious, and you're going to run into problems with the First Amendment on that. But creation science also, because of its fixation on young earth and a literal Noah's flood and biblical literalism in general, was not very attractive to a wide variety of Christians. It really only appealed to biblical literalists. So Buell and his companions tried to come up with a kind of anti-evolutionism that would learn from the mistakes of the past, so to speak. The first book that Foundation for Thought and Ethics put out was this book, The Mystery of Life's Origin, by Thaxton, Bradley, and Olson, which is considered the founding document of the intelligent design movement. Now, in Mystery of Life's Origin, the phrase intelligent design does not appear. The name intelligent design was not chosen for this movement until several years later. But in 1984, the first intelligent design document was published, and it was this book. As you can guess from the title, it had to do with the origin of life. And the argument was made that the origin of life was not only unsolved, it was unsolvable. That the origin of life represented a class of scientific problems that you simply had to take off the table for finding a natural cause, because it was simply unsolvable through natural cause. As the biologist Dean Kenyon wrote in the foreword to this book, it is fundamentally implausible that unassisted matter and energy organized themselves into living systems. The argument in Mystery of Life's Origin is that the origin of life, because of its incredible complexity, requires intelligence. It required an outside force. Now, of course, the logical question is, you mean God? And they said, well, we think it's God, but it doesn't have to be God. This is a science book. Mystery of Life's Origin was intended to be a science book. And so it was only in the afterword that they mentioned, we think it's God, but hey, could be a material intelligence. It could be a matter and energy intelligence. Maybe it's extraterrestrials. It's God. They don't really think it's extraterrestrials. Trust me on this. Trust me on this. The argument that structural complexity requires intelligence, requires the direct hand of God, of course, is the original argument made by William Paley in his book Natural Theology. It's known by philosophers as the argument from design. Remember Paley? He's the guy with the watch. If you see a watch, you know, because of all of the complexity of all the little pieces that fit together in a purposeful arrangement of parts, the springs and the wires and the glass and all the stuff, you know that this watch, all the parts could not have come together to make a functioning timekeeping device. You know there had to be a watchmaker, of course. Nobody's going to argue. You see a complex human artifact, obviously there had to be some creature who made it. He says, you take a look at something like the vertebrate eye, and it's the same thing as a human artifact, he says. It is composed of a bunch of different parts that are all fit together so incredibly cunningly to bring light into the brain and make it make sense and so forth, that there had to be a God, because something like the vertebrate eye could not come about through natural cause. Again, this equation that I mentioned before, that anything natural has to be chance or random. Natural causes can't produce things that are designed, that are functional, that are complex. Well, of course, Charles Darwin in 1859 in his book On the Origin of Species proposed natural selection as a natural mechanism that does exactly this. And basically in science, natural selection, a natural mechanism, replaced the argument from design. It was now possible to study complex biological structures and infer natural origins for them. So The Mystery of Life's Origin was the first production from this group of people who were trying to come up with an alternative anti-evolutionism to creation science, which wasn't working very well either in the general public or certainly in the courts. In 1981, the Students for Origins Research publication announced the publication of a creation biology book. A high school biology book will be sensitively written to present both evolution and creation while limiting discussion to scientific data. This is the book that became Of Pandas and People, which was the book that was at the center of the intelligent design controversy in Dover. It was the first major publication to use the phrase intelligent design to refer to this argument from design that was expressed in Mystery of Life's Origin, but which basically goes back to William Paley. Now, I'm sorry I have to do this because I can't possibly talk about pandas and people without mentioning at least one example of the really, really bad science in Pandas and People. A very good reason to not use this book in the high school classroom is because the science is just wrong. In Pandas and People, one of the things that they talk about is the biochemical evidence for evolution, which they challenge. And here is a cytochrome C diagram showing frog, turtle, chicken, rabbit, horse. And you'll notice that the distance from carp, from a fish, is approximately the same to all of these tetrapods or land vertebrates, 13, 14, etc. Here's what the text says in regard to this diagram. Amphibians, represented in the chart by the bullfrog, are traditionally considered closer to fish in the evolutionary scale. Yet on a molecular level, they are no closer to fish than to reptiles or to mammals. To use the classic Darwinian scenario, amphibians are intermediate between fish and the other land-dwelling vertebrates. Analysis of their amino acids should place amphibians in an approximately intermediate position, but it does not. That snort of derision you hear is the evolutionary biology next to you. This is not what we think evolution is about. We do not, surprise now it can be told, we do not believe that there is a sequence from fish to amphibians to reptiles to mammals and birds. That's not how we look at it. What that is, and what the assumption behind this diagram is something that also dates from the Middle Ages, something called the Great Chain of Being, the ladder of life, where the worm mounting through the spires of form, striving to be man, as Emerson said. Simple invertebrates evolve into more complex invertebrates, evolve into simple vertebrates, evolve into amphibians and reptiles, and simple mammals and more complex mammals, and guess who's, of course, on top? Not very hard to figure that out. But this is the great, I didn't vote for him. This is the great chain of being. This is not what evolutionary biology believes happened in the history of life. Let me show you what real evolutionary biology is, okay? Here's the fish. This is a cytochrome C table, so these are the same data as presented in Pandas and People. This is basically a vertebrate tree. Okay, here's fish, which are aquatic vertebrate. I want to call your attention to this node in the tree right here. That node is the common ancestor of all of the land vertebrates. Land vertebrates are tetrapods, as they're called. That includes amphibians, reptiles, mammals, birds. Okay, dinosaurs, the whole lot of them. All the four-legged land animals, and that's all of us. We're four-legged too. We just happen to totter around on two legs instead. That's why we have backaches. This is a medical school. You know all about that. All of the land vertebrates are descended from this common ancestor, which means they all are equally distant from fish. So the cytochrome C data showing equal distances between fish and all of the tetrapods is exactly what the scientific literature predicts, exactly what the scientific model of evolution predicts, if you understand it. If you misstate it, if you make a straw man, obviously you can criticize it. And the book of Pandas and People is just chock full of bad science of exactly this nature. Intelligent design, then, takes the same approach as does creation science, in that the argument, I forgot, there's one more point I'm going to make. during the course of the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial, one of the things that we discovered is that there were, in fact, earlier manuscripts of Pandas and People book, which had very creationist-sounding titles like Creation Biology, Biology and Creation, things like that. And so we suggested to the lawyers that there might be some data out there might be some evidence that would directly tie intelligent design to creation science, and this, of course, would be very useful in the court because, as I mentioned, because of the Supreme Court decision, Edwards versus Aguillard, creation science has already, we've been there, done that. Creation science is unconstitutional. If intelligent design is viewed, it can be shown to be a subset of creation science, then the work of the lawyers is a lot easier. So the lawyers subpoenaed these earlier manuscripts, and when we analyzed them, we found gold. We found exactly the kind of evidence that we needed to show that intelligent design was merely relabeled creation science. And let me show you one example of those data. There's more than just this example. In a book called Biology and Creation, the manuscript is dated, a manuscript entitled Biology and Creation, dated 1986, this passage occurs. And I've highlighted the important words for you to pay attention to here. Creation means that the various forms of life began abruptly through the agency of an intelligent creator with their distinctive features already intact. Fish with fins and scales, birds with feathers, beaks and wings, etc. Okay, this is special creation, isn't it? The creation of entities in their present form, fish with fins and scales, as we see them today. And abruptly, okay? And this is pretty much what the early manuscripts all had. Creation means intelligent creator, fish with fins and scales, and so forth. The first book to be titled Of Pandas and People had the exact same paragraph. Creation means abrupt appearance, agency of an intelligent creator. This is the missing link. All right? Because the date on this manuscript is 1987, which those of you who have been paying attention will remember is the date of Edwards versus Aguillard. Another manuscript dated 1987, titled Of Pandas and People, learned from the Edwards versus Aguillard decision, and what we see is intelligent design means that various forms of life began abruptly through an intelligent agency, with their distinctive features already intact, fish with fins and scales, and so forth. So basically, intelligent design is just relabeled creation science. And we were able to show this over and over and convince the judge that this was in fact the case. So the evidence against evolution approach is certainly part of the intelligent design position as it is a part of creation science. And there's many intelligent design books out there which present this idea that evolution is a theory in crisis, and it's very, very weak scientifically, and that evidence against evolution is, in fact, evidence for intelligent design. This, of course, is the old two-model approach, only instead of evidence against evolution supporting creationism, it is proof of intelligent design. The Discovery Institute is the major think tank promoting intelligent design. It's out in Seattle, Washington, and they are circulating a model policy that would suggest that rather than teaching evolution and balancing it with intelligent design, you teach evolution and balance it with just the evidence against evolution, thinking that if you do that, then you will avoid the problems that intelligent design policies like Dover's had. If you just teach the content and don't label it intelligent design, so to speak, that this will allow you to duck the First Amendment Establishment Clause. So the policy says that teachers can encourage students to consider strengths and weaknesses of evolutionary theory. The policy does not call for the study of creationism, nor does it call for the study of intelligent design theory. But it's okay if you want to teach it. These permissive policies are also cropping up around the country. You don't have to teach intelligent design, wink, wink, nudge, nudge. And obviously a teacher who wants to may indeed go forth and do so. This model policy has shown up in Grantsburg, Wisconsin, and we expect to see it showing up in other school districts around the country. The euphemisms for the evidence against evolution are many. the critically analyze evidence for evolution, such as the Discovery Institute policy, teach evidence for and evidence against, strengths and weaknesses of evolution. Many disclaimers are promoting the teaching of evolution as theory, not fact. And I always say, well, of course evolution is a theory. Theories explain facts. Theories are much more important than facts. But that's not how these policies are meant. These policies are using the word theory like we use it on the street. Well, evolution is just a theory. In science, evolution is just a theory, just like gravitation is just a theory. And so we use the word theory very differently from these kinds of policies. Teach the full range of views about origins. Teach all the scientific alternatives to evolution. And teach the controversy, which is the Discovery Institute mantra. The Discovery Institute, in fact, has just published a book on the Kitzmiller versus Dover trial. It didn't take them very long at all, in which they promote, again, the teaching of these critically analyze evidence against evolution kinds of policies. So what we basically have today in the anti-evolution movement and the effort to try to teach standard science to students is an evolutionary system, if you will, where creation science is evolved into intelligent design, which has evolved into what you could call a pedagogical strategy of critical thinking. Teach evolution, but teach the critical analysis, the evidence against, the strengths and weaknesses, et cetera, all the euphemisms. The critical thinking argument kind of takes a couple of possible branches. One is the evidence against evolution kind of branch, and the other is to encourage the teaching of all scientific alternatives to evolution. Well, if you were to go to a biology department in a standard university like this one and say, biology professor, could you please tell me the evidence against evolution? And you'd be met with blank looks. They have no idea what you're talking about. There is no evidence against the inference that living things shared common ancestor. We all are pretty well happy with that. We argue a lot about the pattern of evolution. We argue a lot about the mechanisms of evolution. We're not arguing over whether living things had common ancestors. That's just a done deal. Any more than geologists argue about whether continents move. There is no anti-continental drift movement, thank goodness for them. But if there were, they would probably, they'd feel it the same way. If you were to go to that same biology professor and say, okay, prof, what are the other scientific theories that are alternatives to evolution? You'd be met with yet another blank look, because there aren't any other scientific theories other than living things had common ancestors. The only alternative theories that you get are religiously based ones like creation science and intelligent design. But when you ask the proponents of these ideas, well, give me an example of an alternative theory, it somehow comes right back to intelligent design. So here we are again. We've seen quite a few examples of this morphing from creation science to intelligent design to the critical thinking kind of pedagogical strategy over the last few years, and we fully expect to see a great deal more of it in the future. Now, in conclusion, let me give, and we also have a lot of examples of legislation it's only April. Already we've had all this legislation. Anti-evolution legislation of one form or another, in which either evolution is going to be denigrated as theory, not fact, in the common sense of the term, or some form of intelligent design or alternative theories or whatever. Most of these will probably go by the board, assuming, of course, that people actually oppose them. But this idea of teaching the alternatives to evolution is quite popular in the general public. This fairness argument is so extremely attractive to Americans with our general policy of democratic traditions, town hall meetings, and so forth. Free speech is a wonderful thing. It just is not incredibly relevant when it comes to science, because we don't teach alternative theories in science class if they don't work. In fact, in science, we are cheerfully discriminatory about those explanations which don't work for us anymore, and we simply don't teach them. But the general public likes this fairness kind of argument. And in a poll conducted by the Zogby organization for the Discovery Institute in 2001 in the state of Ohio, the Zogby push poll asked, biology teachers should teach only Darwin's theory of evolution and the scientific evidence that supports it, Not very much enthusiasm in the public for that. Biology teachers should teach Darwin's theory of evolution, but also the scientific evidence against it. And a large proportion of the population agrees with that. Well, if you talk to a biology professor, there are no scientific data against common ancestry. I think what polls like this pick up is an American sense of fairness. Let's give both sides. And this would be like saying we should teach the scientific evidence for heliocentrism and the evidence against it. You'd probably get 70% of the public saying, yeah, we should do that. But that's where we are. Okay, where you go for more information. Very good book by Forrest and Gross discussing the intelligent design strategy of the wedge. It's more of a historical and social and political book, but very well documented. A bit of a polemic, but well documented. Why Intelligent Design Fails is a collection of articles collected by Matt Young and Tanner Edis about the scientific shortcomings of intelligent design. My colleague Rob Pennock's excellent collection of articles, Intelligent Design Creationism and Its Critics, dealing with intelligent design across the board. Another, Nell Shanks, God, the Devil, and Darwin, talks about more philosophical issues. A new book by Mark Isaac, The Counter-Creationism Handbook, deals with both creation science and intelligent design arguments, and gives very quick and very, very nice bulleted points, so to speak, on why these are bad science. Kenneth Miller's Finding Darwin's God is both a very good refutation of creation science and intelligent design. Plus, in the latter part of the book, he takes off his scientist hat and puts on his personal religion hat and says, as a practicing Catholic, here is why I find evolution to be very acceptable in my faith tradition and why it actually makes science very meaningful to me. But he separates that away from the science, which I think is how it should be done. If you are a teacher, Brian and Sandra Alter's book, Defending Evolution in the Classroom, is an excellent book. Brian Alters is a former evangelical Christian. He understands the culture that objects to evolution. He's very sympathetic toward their concerns, and he provides some suggestions for teachers on how to deal with this topic sensitively. My book, I think, is also helpful. I would encourage you to take a look at that as well. And Rob Pennock's book, Tower of Babel, is still the single best anti-intelligent design book out there. And I can say that because I learned a whole lot from it in reading it over the years. Recommend two websites, pandasthumb.org, which deals specifically with intelligent design, and talkorigins.org, which deals more with creation science, but also includes intelligent design as well. And of course, at the National Center for Science Education, we do deal with these local controversies. It kind of feels like that some of the time around our office. And you can go to our website as well, ncseweb.org. And I and my colleagues, Eric Mickle, Wesley Ellsbury, Susan Spath, Nick Motzke, and Glenn Branch, are happy to answer your questions and help you understand this very vexing but nonetheless fascinating problem of the creationism and evolution issue. And now we have to change computers, so I will ask Scott, our very competent technician, to come down and do his magic here so that we can get ready to hear Rob Pennock. And maybe this would be a good time for you to introduce Rob while he's making that change. Thank you.
Should we just... Let me take that.
Something did not work this time.
Obviously, evidence against intelligent design.
Okay. Detect displays, yeah, okay. And,
This time it's not detecting.
okay, right.
Is there something that, it looks like it's gone to the,
Oh,
there we
there
go.
you go. See, we did it this time, okay. It'll,
Yeah, it looks like something is loose.
yeah, there.
There it is.
It's relighting.
All right, well, we survived the technological issues here. So our second speaker for the evening is Robert Pennock. He's a professor of history and philosophy of science at Michigan State University. He has directed faculty workshops on research ethics and the evolution and the nature of science. And as you heard, he's author of several books, including The Tower of Babel, Evidence Against the New Creationism, which attacks the advocates of creation science and intelligent design theory upon the evidence of the actual basis for evolution. This book was, as Eugenie Scott has indicated, is a really excellent introduction to this topic and was actually nominated for the Pulitzer Prize and the National Book Award. Most recently, I think one of the things that Robert Pennock brings to the stand is a very interesting experience as having served as an expert witness in the Dover trial that you've heard a little bit about. And in fact, the opinion, if you read it, echoes many of the things that I think you'll hear about tonight in his presentation. So I hope you'll join me in welcoming Robert Pennock to the stage.
Thanks very much. I appreciate the invitation here. We'll do a little mic check. Is this sufficient for those of you in the back? If there is a problem, start waving about it, and I'll try to pay attention to that. My voice is a little bit better today. I've been doing the new parent thing and not sleeping for the last month. I just have a new baby, and so the voice just totally lost it with a cold and stuff that came along with that lack of sleep. The new baby boy joins a 4-year-old daughter, and like many of you, I think that's part of the motivation for many of us in this, wanting to have a good sound education for our kids, and this is where the attacks continue to come. So that's one of the things that I care about. The other thing is just caring about the integrity of science, and that really is what is being attacked here. And my job tonight is really to talk to you about the ground rules of science and why it is that creationism and intelligent design creationism undermine that and really don't qualify. So here's the headline that I want to show you from the end of the Kitzmiller trial, where the judge wrote a wonderful 168-page document that really goes into great detail. But the two words that got pulled out from that document summarizing the view was breathtaking inanity. And here are the conclusions that he drew after listening for 6 weeks to all of the evidence. Intelligent design, he said, is a religious alternative masquerading as a scientific theory. And that's the key important message. Creationists put forth their view under whatever name they're using currently, creation science, intelligent design theory, put it forward as though it's a scientific theory to be taken seriously. And they'll often use scientific sounding language, but it's a masquerade. And that's what the judge saw after seeing the evidence. It's masquerading, but really underneath it is a sectarian religious view, not even just a generic one, but really a sectarian religious view. It's creationism relabeled. That was one of the straightforward conclusions that he drew in this. And we've seen some of the evidence for that which was very clearly presented in the trial. What does all this lead to? Well, it leads to the conclusion that's important from the legal perspective, namely that teaching this in the public schools is unconstitutional. Putting forward a particular religious view, no matter what you call it, is a violation of the Establishment Clause, violates the separation of church and state. That's the legal issue that was decided here, reiterating the decision in the earlier case where creation science had been the label. So those are the conclusions. That's where we're going to get to, and what I want to do now is take you through some of the arguments to show how the judge came to that decision. Really, it has to do with the ground rules of science, and that term came up again and again in the trial. I made the point that it violates the ground rules of science, but it was something where I could actually draw very directly from the intelligent design creationists' own writings, because they've used that term as well, that if you accept the ground rules of science, we won't be able to be accepted. We have to change the ground rules of science. The judge cited not just me, but some of their own experts on this. So it was a very basic point that both sides agreed with. The two key theses that are important from the legal point of view are the ones that are listed there, that intelligent design is not science and that it is a sectarian religion. The claim that this is something that should pass muster is built on the claim that this is science, and the judge took the request really from both sides to issue a judgment on that. Does it count as science or not? And also looking directly at the key point, is it religion? And here's the quote from his decision, which addresses those, that ID aspires to change the ground rules of science to make room for religion, and specifically beliefs consonant with a particular version of Christianity. And I want to just emphasize particular here. It's important that the judge put that in. It's very common in the public mind to think that creationism just means a general belief in God, and that's not at all the case. Creationists have a very particular view of how God did it. It's one that says God couldn't have done it this way, that rules out evolution as a possible way in which creation might have happened. So, as we'll see a bit later, many mainstream Christian denominations reject creationism and intelligent design as well, and that's something that the judge pointed out. This is a particular version here. All right, well, what occasioned this? What happened actually in Dover? The school board there instituted a policy. They had a number of creationist supporters, a majority on the board, and they said, we're going to have a change in the curriculum that will update it. Okay, we're going to be cutting edge here. Students, they said, are going to be made aware of gaps and problems in Darwin's theory, and we saw already what that actually comes to. It's the evidence against. They should learn the arguments opposing it. But they also explicitly said that they'll learn about other theories, not limited to, but here's the named one, intelligent design. Leave out origins of life, they're going to say. And then they list specifically the textbook of Pandas and People as a reference book that's going to be put into the library. 60 copies of the book were donated to the library. One of the things that came out in the trial was how one of the board members was involved in sort of surreptitiously seeing how that anonymous donation occurred. So there was a little under-the-table stuff that was going on. Before the trial even got started, though, someone from England emailed me to say, he had studied in school in central Pennsylvania, and he was rather upset about this and asked whether I would mind if they donated 60 copies of my book to the library. and I should have just said yes. But what I said was, it would make a better statement if what we put there instead were 60 copies of different books, because there's a lot of evidence for evolution. And this would really make a nice contrasting case the one book that they have compared to the vast amounts of evidence that we have on the other side. The other thing that they asked was that there be a disclaimer read before discussion in any class included evolution. And here's something from the disclaimer. And you see here the same language that Eugenie Scott talked about, the focus on the colloquial notion of theory. The first part in green here, Darwin's theory is a theory. Now, if you just read it straightforwardly, that's just a tautology. Of course that's true. It says it right there, right? No one's going to dispute that. But what's going on here is an intentional conflation of the scientific notion to the colloquial notion, which contrasts theory and fact. And they say it explicitly here, the theory is not a fact. Whereas in fact in ordinary scientific cases, we use theories to explain facts, and once we have a very well-confirmed theory, we'll say that the theory is factual. Okay? That's a very common thing to say. So these are not opposites in the way that's suggested here. They, again, talk about gaps, problems, and then bring in intelligent design supposedly as an explanation that differs from this. Okay? This is going to be what's at issue. Does intelligent design really count as a scientific explanation? Well, let's take a look at what they say. You had expected to have a debate here where someone would take the intelligent design side, so I almost think I ought to do that. And so let me take their side for a moment. I was actually on the stage together with one of the two of the most known intelligent design creationists, Michael Behe and William Dembski. And in that, I actually tried to do so. I said, let me become one of you. What should I teach if I were an intelligent design theorist? And the thing that I found there was that they were not willing to say. They're hiding their views. Unlike science, which puts its views right on the table and says, let's look at the evidence for it. A very great contrast between the two, and shows you the masquerade that's going on. But let's take a look at some of their brochures at least. Here was a brochure from the Center for the Renewal of Science and Culture, which was the wing of the Discovery Institute in its original name. They've now removed the renewal of part of this because that has connotations that are a little too much like Christian Reconstruction and renewal and so on. They've taken that part out. The other thing that they've done is take out God from their logo. In the original logo, they had both God and Adam, the original Sistine Chapel view. Then they removed Adam, put in the DNA. In more recent ones, they took God out and just had a very nebulous view there. All part of a step-by-step disguising of the view to make the religious parts of it more and more hidden. Well, let's look inside to see what they want to say this is. Design theory, they say, is a new science for a new century. So the claim is this is forward-looking. And in fact, school boards are encouraged to do this as a way of being cutting edge, as I say. Well, what do they claim? They say that this isn't just biology, this is something in physics. The finely tuned way in which the constants of physics are put together should be taken as evidence of this super intellect and so on. And this is one thing that's important to emphasize. This is not just a matter of biology and evolution, although that's the key way in which we see it. This is really an attack upon a whole range of sciences. And we often leave this out, but physics is being attacked as well. And really, geology and the other sciences have to be included as well. It's not the case that there aren't any, as Jeannie was mentioning, anti-plate tectonics views out there. One of the co-authors of Pandas and People, Percival Davis, in one of his earlier books called A Case for Creation, actually argues against plate tectonics. He says that violates what he takes to be the reading in Genesis. So there really are folks who will attack the specifics of a whole range of different views. From my point of view as a philosopher of science, though, I'm interested in the way in which they're attacking the nature of science itself. This is an attack upon the ground rules of science. but most of the focus is upon the biology, upon evolution. And here's the other thing that they say to draw attention to that: the presence of complex, functionally integrated machines. The bacterial motor over here has cast doubt, they say, on Darwinian mechanisms of self-assembly, sparked new interest in the design hypothesis. The bacterial motor there is Michael Behe's key example of irreducible complexity. It's kind of the poster child. Was mentioned again and again and again in the Dover trial. It seemed as though the whole edifice of intelligent design was riding on the tail of the flagellum because it just was mentioned so often. Here are some of the main folks that you'll see. Philip Johnson was a law professor, and he's the one who really came up with the legal strategy. He's sort of thought of as the godfather of the movement. Credited with bringing together what previously had been warring factions within creationism, the young Earth camp, the old Earth camp. Both those camps saw themselves as taking the Bible seriously and literally, but they disagreed about how to read some of Genesis. And they would fight with each other as much as they would fight against evolution. And Johnson said, let's set aside our differences until we can overcome our enemy. And after that, we can discuss about the age of the earth and those sorts of things. And so he negotiates this compromise, and what happens in intelligent design is that you have young Earth creationists and old Earth creationists coming together essentially against their common enemy. Michael Behe, you've heard him mentioned before, William Dembski, Wells, Meyer, and Nelson. Behe, Dembski, and Meyer were all slated to be experts on the intelligent design side in the trial, but at the very last moment, Dembski and Meyer both withdrew, leaving Behe and some other of their witnesses who were not part of the core committee, but really important ones from their point of view to take the stand. All right, well, what does intelligent design say? What are they offering? Well, they don't always tell you the same thing, and this is one of the things that gets very frustrating as you go along, because you'll hear in the media especially certain things reported as this is what intelligent design is, and here's an example of one of the things. Intelligent design is a strictly scientific theory devoid of religious commitments. That's the sort of thing that they will say when they're being interviewed. But you just look a little bit further on, or listen to them when they're talking to their supporters, and you see quite a different view. Here's another quote. "The world is a mirror representing the divine life. The mechanical philosophy was ever blind to this fact. Intelligent design, on the other hand, readily embraces the sacramental nature of physical reality. Indeed," here's almost a definition, "intelligent design is just the logos theology of John's gospel restated in the idiom of information theory." Okay? Now, that's the very same person saying both of those things, and really even in the same year. It just depends upon reading a little more carefully to find the basis of this. And that's one of the things that we were able to do in the trial, is give the history, show the parts of the theory that are not talked about by them in public, but for which there was a very long and detailed record. Here was one of the great parts of that record. The wedge strategy, or the wedge document, was a document that was leaked from the Discovery Institute that laid out essentially a series of 5-year plans on how they're going to overturn the materialistic worldview. And in this internal document for their fundraising purposes, they were quite explicit about what this was all about. The social consequences, they say, of materialism have been devastating. And this sort of brings up a part that we haven't talked about yet, but the motivation for many creationists is what they take to be social decay, and they think that evolution is to blame for that. The symptoms that we see, and they'll mention things like homosexuality, divorce, even bestiality. They think of as a social problem here that's caused by evolutionary thinking. Okay, and so, well, we need to treat those things, but really we need to get to the basis of them, to the cause. And what's the cause? The cause is this particular worldview. Okay. It's the worldview of materialism, and that's what he says. That's what the document says we have to cut off at the source. The source is scientific materialism. Okay? So those are the terms that are behind there. Let me just say a little bit about what that is. They take this notion of materialism and conflate a couple of different things. Materialism in its philosophical sense is a view about the ultimate nature of reality. Right? This is the thing philosophers talk about. What's the ultimate nature of reality? And metaphysicians go into this in great detail, and there's a huge and very worthy literature on the subject. But a metaphysical view of something says, here's what it is, and that's the end of it. So if you're a materialist in that metaphysical sense, what you're saying is the world is made of matter, matter in motion, and that's it. Okay? There is no supernatural realm. There is no separate substance of mind. There is no God. All of those things are rejected by a metaphysical materialist. Okay? But that's not the end of the story, and that's not what scientific materialism is. They're conflating that metaphysical, philosophical view with something that is a methodology. Methodological naturalism, which is what science follows, is a view that says what we will do as scientists is only appeal to those things that we're able to test in the natural world, okay? Things that we can get evidence for. And we can't do that with regard to the supernatural. And so we're going to set that aside. We'll have to be neutral about that because there's no way for us to test it. So methodologically, our explanations have to appeal to things within the natural world, things for which we can have experiments and observations, draw inferences based upon what we can know in a mundane fashion, and we have to set aside these philosophical questions. It's not that they're not important, but that's just not the business of science. Okay? You leave that to the philosophers, you leave that to the theologians, and you, as a scientist, say, we're constrained to this type of method. Now, that's a really different position. That's not saying that there isn't, in principle, anything beyond matter. It's simply saying, as part of the ground rules of science, we just can't say anything about it. And what the creationists do is conflate the two. In fact, they will say, oh, methodological naturalism, that's just equivalent to, or essentially equivalent to, the metaphysical view. And then they talk about the latter. That's what they're really wanting to oppose, right? They're wanting to oppose the basic methodology of science. And here's what they want to substitute in its place. Design theory is supposed to do that, they say. Promises to reverse the stifling dominance of the materialist worldview and to replace it with a science consonant with Christian and theistic convictions. Okay? So in this internal document, they're quite clear as to what's going on, right? This is a crafted view with the purpose of overturning really the basis of scientific reasoning and to bring in back into place a theistic worldview. Sometimes I'll talk about this as a theistic science. Philip Johnson in his book used those terms. Now, what's wrong with that? Well, one of the things that's wrong with that is, it would just be too easy. Let me just show why. Here's Darwin. He's at his desk and he's about to start thinking and working about developing the evidence for his view. He's been on the Beagle, right? He's thought, here's an idea that I think is right. And as you all know, if you know the history, Darwin spends 20 years working at this before he publishes The Origin of Species. But he's just thinking there, and you can just imagine what it's like. It's going to take me 20 years to do this. Should be a lot easier to go with creationism, right? What would you have to do in that case? You just say, well, complexity. That's really puzzling. God did it. The end, right? It'd be a lot easier. And anything in science, if you were to come up against a problem, here's something I can't figure out, that would then always be an easy way out, okay? It would make the work of the scientist too easy, right? It would essentially undermine the whole notion. Questions in science are the thing that prod us to move forward. creationists are always saying, well, you can't explain this, you can't explain that, well, what about this? This is the evidence against. They want to say these are things that you don't have explanations for. For scientists, that's a good thing, right? An unanswered question is a research opportunity. That's the sort of thing that allows graduate students to still have things to do, right? If we could take the easy way out, we could be popping out PhDs right and left, right? Design theory would be very simple. But that's just not science, okay? So that's a very pragmatic notion of why this doesn't even work. Now, what would it mean? And let's take a look a little more specifically at what an intelligent design explanation might look like. So, Pandas and People, here's the textbook. And here's one of the examples that I'm just going to draw from it to sort of show you the pattern that they follow. They've just spent a little section talking about homologies, structures across different species that have similar structure that you can then use to infer common ancestry. Classic example of this is the bone structure in the hand, and the bone structure in the wing of a bat, for example. You can see the way in which these things just match each other in the pattern, even though one has been stretched out in a certain way. So, examples of that sort. So, this book is going to present interpretations of the data for those who hold the two views. Okay? Those who hold the Darwinian view and those who hold the intelligent design view. Okay? Now, notice the language there. The two alternatives, okay? As though they're just two. So this is what we've seen Eugenie talk about. This is the dual model. They're going to make it set up so that students will think there are two alternatives, and then what they're going to try to do is knock down the one and leave the other as the default leftover. Okay. So here's the example now. Is there any alternative explanation for the marsupial bones in pouches? Actually, excuse me, this is a slightly different example than the bone one, but it's the same notion, other than that they're homologous and therefore evidence of common ancestry? Yes, they say. There is another theory, and that's that marsupials were all designed with these reproductive structures, okay? And then you might think that they're going to go on and say something more, but that's it, right? That's the end of the explanation. The explanation is that they were designed like that. And for each of the kinds of cases that they bring up, they say, well, how can you believe the evolutionary explanation? We have another one, and this is what they give. It was designed that way. How do you explain those complexities? Evolution can't do that. How could chance do that? We have an explanation. It was designed. Okay? Again, this makes science very, very easy. Now, that's what you find. And in all of my reading on this, I've only found one example where they have something more detailed than that. And this is an example from Philip Johnson's book where he talks about the peacock. Okay? Now, evolution has something to say about how the tail of the peacock could involve sexual selection. But they don't buy that. They don't think that there's any way that you can explain that. And here's what Johnson says. The peacock is something that an uncaring evolutionary process would never allow to develop, but which is just the kind of creature that a whimsical creator might favor. Okay. So here's what you should think, right? On the one hand, right, evolution, right? It gives you processes, well-confirmed, things that we've tested. On the other hand, divine whimsy. Okay. So here's the question: can you tell which is science, okay, and which is not? Right? So this is the point here. Again and again, and you just see that although you use scientific-sounding language, there isn't any evidence there. There's no positive evidence for the view. The view is really a negative one. It's an attack upon evolution. It's an attack upon science itself. And here's what the judge said. Okay? Not one defense expert was able to explain how the supernatural action suggested by ID could be anything other than a religious proposition. Right? It's not a scientific proposition. So, accordingly, we find that ID's religious nature would be further evident to our objective observer because it's directly involving a supernatural designer. Okay? That becomes the key point of this, right? By recognizing that as the element, the explanatory element in intelligent design. That by itself lets you know it's not science. It also, at the same time, lets you know this is a religious view. Okay. If you need to have sort of a one-stop summary of why this doesn't work in science, this is my favorite one from Sidney Harris from American Scientist. The two scientists working at the board, one has gotten this great series of equations, he's really worked hard, and in the middle he says, well, then a miracle occurs. And the other scientist critically evaluates this. Yeah, I think you should be a little more explicit here in step 2. Okay? Again, this is the point. You can't just appeal to a miracle, to a supernatural intervener. That's no explanation. Science always demands more. Again, this is not to say that science says there aren't supernatural beings, right? It's just to say you can't appeal to them in science. Right? Science has to remain neutral with regard to that and doesn't accept that as part of an explanation. It actually undermines the notion of what an explanation is. I just want to briefly step to the theological side to show how this structure here is not only problematic for scientists for the reasons I've just mentioned, but it's also problematic from a religious point of view. And here I'm going to quote Francis Collins, the director of the Human Genome Project, who is himself an evangelical Christian, and he will often talk about the relationship of science and religion from the point of view of someone who is a believer. And he was asked on the Tucker Carlson show about the intelligent design view. And he's quite straightforward in saying this just isn't science. But he goes a little bit further here and says, here's why it's also objectionable from my point of view as a Christian. He says, I'm not an advocate of intelligent design. I think that intelligent design sets up a God of the gaps kind of scenario. Okay. Now, this is not original to Collins. The God of the gaps is a standard term in theology that refers to a particular type of argument that's very common, but which theologians think is very bad from a theological point of view. And it goes like this. You can sort of see it in the next line from Collins. Well, we haven't yet explained this particular feature of evolution, so God must be there. And you've already seen that structure of the argument before. Here's something that you guys can't explain, you scientists. Must have been designed, right? Had to have been some non-natural intervention. That's where God is, right? God is brought in to explain that which science can't explain, to fill the gaps. Okay? And Collins says, watch what happens. That's why this is a problem. If science ultimately proves that those gaps aren't gaps after all, then where's God? Okay? We really ought not ask people to do that. Okay? So this is what theologians have always said. The God of the gaps argument is essentially a negative argument against science, or in this case evolution, which says you can't explain this. It's a gap in your explanatory picture. God's there. But what's the history of science? It's the history of filling of gaps. There are lots of things we don't know, but we learn and fill those gaps in. And if you think that's where God is, God continually gets squeezed out. Okay? And theologians think, that's not a good way to think about God. So theologians as well don't like that kind of an argument. That's what Collins is talking about there. Now, I want to spend some time on one particular case, which is the one that's probably most characteristic of the intelligent design movement. And this is the one that was mentioned before in Eugenie's talk. It's the irreducible complexity argument. And it's most well known with relationship to Michael Behe. Here's something from a pro-Behe site. It's the Behe Christian fish about to chomp the Darwin fish. All of this is about fish wars. It's really about the culture wars. But here's something that they put forward as though it's a real scientific argument. So let's take a look at the concept and how it's supposed to work. Here's what Behe says. He's defining his notion. An irreducibly complex system, he says, is a system composed of several well-matched interacting parts that contribute to the basic function. Okay. Now, think of the pocket watch. This is actually Paley's argument, just slightly rephrased. The interacting parts, right? All those little gears moving together in unison to produce the function, namely telling the time. And what happens if you remove any of the parts? This is the second part of Behe's definition, wherein the removal of any one of the parts causes the system to essentially stop functioning, okay? That the basic function there goes away. Now, it's not as though it doesn't do anything anymore, but the function that you've identified as the, in this case, the function of the watch, that doesn't work anymore. Of course, you could still use it to throw at someone, and there are all sorts of other things as well, but that's the key notion here. Okay. Now, why does that make a difference? What's that supposed to be about? Well, here's the argument. It says, such systems can't be produced directly. That's to say, by continuously improving some initial function. He's pointing out to the Darwinian mechanism. By slight modifications of some precursor system. Why? Because any precursor to an irreducibly complex system that's missing a part is, by definition, non-functional. Okay? Doesn't function as a watch anymore. Okay? Now, philosophers, whenever they see by definition, okay, you know something's wrong there. Okay? And really, when you look into the details of this, you see that sometimes they will make this true by definition. They'll say, well, you've given us a counterexample here, but yeah, that must not have been irreducibly complex, because I mean by irreducibly complex something that couldn't have evolved. Okay? That's not going to be a real argument. So let's take it seriously. Let's take this as something where you really could tell independently whether this is irreducibly complex by taking out a part and see whether the function stops. Okay. Well, does that really undermine evolution? Because this is their main challenge. Well, it turns out we have lots of good reasons to show why this isn't so. And I'm going to talk just a little bit now about an experimental way that I and some of my colleagues showed how evolution can produce this. It was actually an investigation to test something else, but it turns out indirectly it does this. So let me just tell you a little bit about what this is. So this is a system that takes the Darwinian mechanism that you've heard about and implements it in an artificial life system. Okay, so what does that mean? What is it that Darwin discovered? He discovered essentially this wonderful law by which you have self-replicators, okay, that randomly vary, okay, and competing with one another are naturally selected over time, iterating this process, such that you have adaptation arising. Those that do a little bit better, those are the ones that survive. They'll be the ones then to be the progenitors of the next generation. It then iterates. And over time, you then get that system producing adaptation to an environment. So we just take that same mechanism and implement it in a computer. Okay? So we have these little computer organisms, which are just a little genome of simple instructions. And if you think about this, it should become pretty clear right away why it is that this is exactly what's happening in the biological case. We even talk about the biological case in terms of a code, a set of instructions. We'll use the notion of DNA and the genome as being a program, a biological program. Well, that's what's going on here. We're putting in place a biological program, but now it's in a computer system. And what we have are little computer organisms. You can think of them as computer viruses, but they're well contained, so they can't get out, don't worry. And they can self-replicate. So we've just written one that can self-replicate. But we also then implement the process. As they self-replicate, you can have random changes in the genome. So any one of those instructions in the genome can be randomly replaced by anything else. So we're implementing this notion of random new variations. And then they can compete with one another, and gosh, what happens? They wind up evolving in just the way that Darwin said. Okay. So this is the system, and you can now use the system to test evolutionary hypotheses. And there are now some 2 or 3 dozen peer-reviewed articles that use this system to test a whole range of hypotheses in science, from how sex can evolve to how altruism can evolve. What we were doing in this particular project, and this was something that was published in Nature, was trying to see whether Darwin's explanation of how complex features arise could be tested in the system, and we could see it in action. So here's what we did. We wanted to see whether they could evolve a complex trait. And this is something about the system that's unique to it. If they're able to evolve code, instructions, that let them produce logical operations, that then gives them extra energy. Okay? It's like learning to metabolize something. Okay? You get a boost of energy, and that it lets you outcompete someone who can't. Okay? So the question is, could they get this reward, okay, of performing a logical function of taking two numbers, in this case they have to be 32-bit strings, pretty big numbers, comparing them and then outputting something that says, are they equal or not? And for each place they have to have it exactly right. And it turns out that that's a pretty complicated thing to evolve. It takes about 19 instructions, and there's 26 possible instructions. So here's sort of a calculation of how unlikely any one of them would be. Okay? Not something you're just going to get. Well, could they do it? Well, we'd do a test. We have replicants of the population. In one set, they're only going to get rewarded if they do that. In the other set, they're going to do what Darwin expected, which was that they're going to get rewarded for simpler things as well. Okay? So Darwin thought that you had functions that would be co-opted for other things. Okay? So implement that. See which one, if any, can perform this. And it turns out that in that second set of populations, 23 of the populations wound up evolving individuals that could perform this. Okay? So pretty amazing. They wound up doing it. Now, as I say, the point of the project here was to investigate some other things. I won't go into that. But the part that's relevant for us here is that once you found someone who has evolved that ability, you can now look at it and ask, how did they do it? Okay? You can look in at the genome and start knocking out instructions one by one and asking yourself, does the function break? Okay? And in fact, turns out they do. And you can see that you have an irreducibly complex system in Behe sense, right? That basic function is lost when you knock them out. Okay, so an irreducibly complex system. There you have it. You've checked it. Behe sense, there it is. Now, here's the thing. We could keep track from an organism that couldn't do that to one at the end of this evolutionary track that could, and we have a complete fossil record. Okay? We can go back and now look, literally mutation by mutation, and see evolution producing, in just the way that Darwin said, an irreducibly complex system from something that previously didn't have it. So Darwin was right. Turns out that the things that he said explained how you get this, namely adopting other functions, co-opting things, having multiple ways to get to it. Those are the things that we find. And this is as direct and precise a refutation of the irreducible complexity claim as you could imagine, right? Mutation by mutation, you can observe it happening. Now, if you get that point, okay, and recognize what it is that evolution is able to do, it's producing these complex functions, and you can implement that in a computer, you now see that evolution is tested and passes the test in really the most clear way that you can hope it to do so. And the claim that irreducible complexity was evidence for intelligent design, you now see why that's not correct. What intelligent design has put forward in irreducible complexity is actually a test of evolution. Okay? It's a challenge to evolution saying you can't do this, and it turns out you can see that evolution does do that. Okay? You can watch it happen. And that's really the final test for any hypothesis in science. Evidence is something that you look for. If you've gotten evidence for something, you can use it. Okay? You've confirmed a hypothesis, and you can then use it to create technology. You can use it to create better therapies. Okay? That's what makes us confident in the end about the truth of what we found. Okay? If it works, right, that's a good reason to think it's true. That's the ultimate test in science. And what we see is evolution works. Okay? And it works in all sorts of ways. And I think this is one of the things that we need to try to get across. Understanding evolution is not just understanding something about what supposedly happened in the past. I mean, that's true about evolution too. But evolution continues to operate, and you have to know about evolution in order to be able to do things. Okay? In a medical school, if you don't understand about how evolution works, you will not know why it is that you have to prescribe antibiotics in a particular way and not other ways, right? It's important to know that, and if you don't, you won't do a good job. Okay? That's something that people need to realize. For someone to be a good physician, they need to know something about evolution. Why do we have confidence in drug trials, right? Well, it's partially having to do with common ancestry, and we know that we can take information that we get from closely related species and transfer it to information about ourselves. There are all sorts of things where evolution works. I like to focus on what I've just talked about, the other part of evolution, which is the mechanism. Right? Darwin discovered that this works in nature. Now we can implement it in computers, and it works. It can produce complex functional outcomes. And let me just give you a short list of this. You can now take what's called evolutionary computation and let evolution design things for you. Okay? And industry is now starting to do this, and evolution is being used in the aerospace industry, it's being used in computer chip manufacturing, it's being used in software development, a whole range of things. You probably now have something on your desk that has had evolution used to design parts of it. Okay? And I think this is something that has not yet penetrated the utility of the mechanism that Darwin discovered. My next book is on this topic, and part of what I hope to do is just show the social utility that evolution works and it's being used. My slogan to people is that Americans will believe evolution when they realize that you can make money with it. That's going to be the thing that will convince them, and that's what's happening now. That's what's happening now. So, quick summary: what was it that the court found? It found ID's not science. 3 different ways in which it's not science. It violates the centuries-old ground rules of science by invoking supernatural causation. Okay? Not acceptable. That by itself is enough to rule this out. The argument of irreducible complexity is flawed. It's illogical. It's not even new. Okay? This is something from creation science as well. And the negative attacks on evolution have been refuted. So all of these things, the judge said, this just is not science. So that's the end, right? It's just not science. Well, what about the new approach? Well, we're not going to mention intelligent design anymore. We'll just talk about teaching the controversy. It was very nice that the judge also paid attention to that and realized that they had started to use that with the gaps problems language in the Dover policy. And the judge said, that's not acceptable either. ID backers, he said, have sought to avoid the scientific scrutiny, which we now determine it cannot withstand, by advocating that the controversy, but not ID itself, should be taught in science classes. So this is the line that's important. That tactic is at best disingenuous and at worst a canard. Okay? That's the ruling here, and I hope that that's something people remember as we get this new line of attack. The judge has already ruled on that. Okay? That disguise didn't work either. Okay, so just summary things to remember, the take-home messages. Intelligent design, right? That's the new 2-word phrase from their side. It had been creation science before, but we now have some 2-word responses. When you hear intelligent design, what should you think? Okay? Creationism, relabeled, okay? Don't get fooled by the words, okay? Calling something science doesn't make it so. 2 more words, not science, okay? Don't let the scientific sounding language fool you here. It's not. And then the final 2 words, and these are the ones I think are most important, breathtaking inanity, okay? So that's what I'll leave you with. And thank you very much.
Okay, now is the time for us to entertain some questions. I'm going to invite Eugenie Scott to come back up. And start with a question back here.
Thank you. My name is Paul Wiggins. I'm a Cherokee half-blood and tribal leader, and I studied philosophy for 3 years at Northwestern in the early 1980s. My question is for Eugenie Scott. You said evolution is a theory just like gravity. It seems to me evolutionism is based on some of the same tacit presuppositions as Middle Eastern monotheism, such as everything's derived from one thing, and all humans come from somewhere in or near Africa. According to Columbus's diaries, the inhabitants of this continent were as white as anyone from Europe, but this is suppressed. And when a village is such as the one recently found in North Carolina, a carbon date as being 40,000 years old, we're told that immigrants must have come here much earlier than anyone thought.
And can you please state your question?
Right. Do you know of any
Can you please state your question?
Do you know of any scientifically compelling evidence that this continent could not have spawned humans similar to the ones in Africa? Centrifugal force describes the path of the planets and our adhesion to this one more elegantly than gravity without resorting to a dozen dimensions because space, like string theory, is therefore more true. And I think evolutionary theory is very inelegant because it maintains that this continent could not have had the same conditions to spawn human life as Africa.
That's not exactly true. There's no reason why, in principle, human beings could not have evolved in North or South America or Australia or any place else. It happens to be that evolution is a historical statement of the genealogical relationship of species through time, as I say. It happens to be the case that the best evidence that we have now is that, as Darwin said, human beings evolved in Africa. That is where our closest living relatives are. If you look at North and South America, you find no fossil record of primates other than very simple primates. You find in Africa the more simple primates, the monkey grade, and also the ape grade. We are more closely related to apes. It's not that anybody's making a statement about Africa is the only place that humans could have evolved, but the best historical and scientific evidence we have is that that is where they evolved.
I'm Roy Slovenko. How do you see the future of this controversy? Is it going to have to be fought state by state, school board by school board, or might there need be another Supreme Court decision that also makes it unconstitutional to force teachers to teach the other side, you know, the supposed evidence against evolution?
All of the above. As we would say in science, the creationism and evolution controversy is a multifactorial problem. It has multifactorial solutions. Science is an essential part of it, but it is not sufficient to solving the problem. The crude way of putting that is we will never solve this problem just by throwing science at it. It is a matter of science, of religion, of education, of people's emotions, of history, of politics. There are lots and lots of different components to this issue. My feeling is the major stumbling block for the Americans who reject evolution is not because it's poor science. Nobody really worries about that, you know. They reject evolution because it conflicts with their faith position. This was the case with heliocentrism 300 years ago. The idea of the planets going around the sun was at one point considered anti-religious. This violated the literal interpretation of the Bible. This is a historical fact. Well, Christians got over geocentrism. I mean, this was not, there are some, by the way, there are some geocentrists within the modern creationist movement, but it's a minority position. There are very few Christians today who would argue that the Bible requires the planets to go around the earth rather than around the sun. I hope it doesn't take 300 years before the majority of Christians in this country agree with, excuse me, I said that wrong. I hope that it doesn't take 300 years before a large minority of Christians in this country agree with a majority of Christians around the world that a literal interpretation of Genesis is not necessary for an understanding of the relationship of God to man.
And in terms of things to do to respond, historically what we've done is just present, as scientists, is respond by saying, well, here's the data, right? Mm-hmm. Here's the evidence and so on. And if you take a look at polls from Gallup, which have been done since the early 80s, there's really no statistically significant difference in the 20, 25 years. Well, we can't just respond in that. That's the natural scientific attitude. But I think we also have to take these other factors into account, that this is seen as part of the culture war, and to respond by talking about values, by talking about the relationship of science as a project in relationship to the religious project, that that's a different kind of thing. And we have to be able to say that accepting evolution is not equivalent to being an atheist, which is the way the creationists specifically want to promote this.
Back there.
Yes, I was wondering, are all the Abrahamic faiths like getting together and ganging up on the other faith systems, trying to get, keeping the other faith systems' creation theories out and pulling theirs in? I mean, what about the Hindus, the Buddhists? Everybody else's, are they warring against them too?
We had someone from the Hindu fundamentalist group come and speak in Michigan and give their alternative view. And they want to have it included under the same rubric, right? It doesn't agree with the Christian view, but they want to include it under the intelligent design heading. In Kansas in 1999, the local Hare Krishnas thanked the board for their courageous stand against evolution. So they'll want to have their alternatives in as well. My favorite are the Raelians. I mean, they think that we're created by extraterrestrials, right? They have explicitly endorsed intelligent design because they want to have their alternative view in as well. If you ask the intelligent design group themselves why they don't invite these folks to their conferences, they say, well, they can have their conferences and so on. They'll allow that as possibilities as well. But I think people who endorse having this in the schools don't really realize who else they would be welcoming in at the same time, and they might not be as welcoming if they thought of all of them.
And of course, the issue for the more sophisticated anti-evolutionist is not teach religious views in opposition to evolution. I mean, the argument from the early 1960s on has been pretend that a religious view is really scientific. That's why it was scientific creationism, remember, and why intelligent design argues that it is a scientific position, because that gives it warrant to be taught along with evolution in a science class. They're not interested, trust me, they are not interested in comparative religion. That has been a compromise that many of us have argued. Well, I personally think that Americans are not only scientifically illiterate, we are theologically illiterate. We should know a lot more about religion, and not just the Abrahamic faiths, not just the world religions. I'm an anthropologist. We should know more about the Cherokee view. We should know more about the other, 60 or 70 American Indian views. We should know more about many of the sub-Saharan African views. There aren't, it's not just like the sun rose and set on Islam, Christianity, and Judaism, which the more sophisticated Americans think is all there is, and they're wrong too. But the argument is made that maybe we should teach people about religion, which is different from advocating a particular religious view in the public schools. They're not happy with that. They want their views advocated, and that you cannot do constitutionally.
Is this a uniquely American battleground? How is it impacting science education in Europe and Asia? We don't have our constitutional,
Let me ask Rob a question. That's the most common question I get when I talk.
too.
Yeah.
Me too.
That's
And
why I wasn't
talk
laughing
about-
at you. I was laughing that.
I was in Italy at the time that the original Kansas story broke, and people there, 1999, and people over there were just shaking their heads. I mean, why is it that this is going on? I gave a talk in Japan, and I talked about this controversy, and it was like they were hearing a story from some obscure tribe. They said, "Isn't America the most scientifically advanced country in the world, and how could this be happening?" I mean, they were just astounded. So that's the reaction that I find overseas.
Every time I get a call from a foreign reporter, it always follows the same trajectory, and I'll bet Rob has had the same experience. I'm an informal person, you've guessed that, and we chat, and she asks me the questions, or he asks me the questions, and I answer the questions, and we establish some rapport, and then after the conversation, after the interview is over, there's this pause, and I know what's coming next. And it's always, can I ask you a question? Yeah, what's wrong with you people? And, this is a problem primarily of American religious history, okay? We have a very unusual kind of Christianity in the United States. mostly because in the 19-teens, about 1912 to about 1918, a series of booklets were written called the 12 Fundamentals, which established a back-to-basics kind of inerrant, biblical inerrancy type of American Christianity that really never took root anyplace else. But fundamentalism is a very strong strain in American Christianity. You don't find this in Europe. You don't find this in Great Britain. You don't find this in other Christian parts of the world, except where American missionaries have been especially active. So you find a lot of fundamentalist Koreans, for example, and they come over to the United States, and they form the foundation for Campus Crusade for Christ and other evangelical type Christian organizations. But that's just sort of a boomerang. I mean, that's American evangelism that's come back to affect us more.
We only have time for one more question.
About the materialism thing, though, and how you define it, I think you are assuming that
You have your own mic,
science
don't you?
will eventually explain everything, that there is no such thing as a miracle. And I don't think that's fair to say. I mean, I think you can say, yeah, well, we haven't explained that yet. We think we probably will.
Mm-hmm.
To say that there's no other alternative explanation out there.
Well, I don't think
So
science
that's not,
does say that.
that's not what
Yeah.
science says. So that was the point of the difference between the
That's
two.
what the curriculum says, right?
No, it
No.
doesn't. Be,
No.
be reassured it does not. Seriously.
And this is crucial to get across
Yeah.
as the difference between the two. If you take
There
a
may be
very
individual
simple
scientists
question.
who promote that, but that's not what the curriculum says.
Think
That's
of
exactly what I heard you say. I heard you kind of laughing that someone, here's the miracle, ha ha ha, what a crazy explanation. And I agree. I mean, I can't believe I'm saying this, but on the other hand, I think we're being a little arrogant.
the point of that was to say that that's not something that falls within the scientific purview. And here's the example I usually give, right? We say that we've tested something like the age of the Earth, for example, right? Say, look, it's more than 6,000 years old. We've shown that already. Now, it's not the case that if you accept in supernatural explanations that you could even say something as simple as that. And some creationists, for example, will say, well, God made it so that the earth looks to be old, but is really young. Okay? Now, if you take that point of view, you allow in supernatural possibilities of this sort, you can never test anything of that sort. I can say that we don't design the outcomes in our experiments, but I don't know that God isn't doing something with regard to that. And the whole point about the methodological view of naturalism is to say, we remain neutral on those other possibilities.
Yeah, but you know what? When I look at the diversity of nature, and there is a peacock, and I say, well, maybe we don't have this completely articulated. There's a difference between a view of saying, but we will eventually, everything's falling into place, and we will eventually explain this using natural selection and the theory of evolution.
Well, so what?
Maybe
I mean,
you won't.
that's right.
We maybe
you
not.
don't.
Leave
We
that
maybe not.
possibility open.
That's always left open.
Yeah.
That's always
I
left
mean,
open.
But it doesn't sound
When
like
we
the
have-
fact that possibility is left
You-
open.
you-
And
you
I
are-
think that's what is alienating these two sides. I think this is a good, and I didn't think coming in here that this was a good dialogue between religious people and science. I think both people will take something good away from it.
Well, maybe that's a nice place to stop. So I
I-
thank you all.
I do want to show you some evidence for evolution, though. Come here. Notice the dark moths are easier to see against a neutral background than the taupe moth. Okay, go ahead.
Thank you very much for coming, and thanks our speakers.